From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome once again to The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast for figurative sculptors around the world. And I'm your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and art historian living and working in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. So if you're a long-time listener to the podcast, you are familiar with the concept that historically, art doesn't happen in a vacuum. Revolutions in painting and sculpture happen side by side with fundamental changes in economics, technology, society, politics, and culture. And these changes influence the way art is made. If you take away, for instance, the Black Death of 1349, or the Reformation, or the Florentine Guild political system, or the personal interests of Cosimo de' Medici, you remove any of those factors and you would not have the art of the Florentine Renaissance as we know it. And so it follows that to understand the art of the Renaissance, you need to understand what was going on outside the workshops of the old masters. Well, we have the same task ahead of us if we are to understand the art of the classical world. 5th century Greece had the same sorts of pressures and influences which shaped the art of its time. It's an example of how what happened in Florence during the Renaissance was in many ways an echo of what happened in classical Greece. The word Renaissance, after all, means, come on people, say it with me, rebirth. Now today, we're going to talk about Naissance, the birth of classical civilization in Greece, and how everything from the birth of democracy, military victories, changes in the technology of producing sculpture, and sudden and unexpected wealth all had a hand in shaping the art of ancient Greece. It's a pretty cool story if you haven't heard it before, but it's sort of a tricky one to tell. So I'm going to sort of bounce back and forth a bit in this episode. First, I'm going to talk about politics and military history, and then talk about sculpture, and then back to politics, and then back to sculpture. But as I said, there's lots of good stories here, so even if I don't talk much about sculpture per se in this one, I think you're going to enjoy this podcast, and it's going to give you the background needed to understand all that follows. So let's pick up where we left off last episode. Now, in the years between 600 and 500 BC, the Archaic style of Greek sculpture centered on the production of religious and votive figures, and these statues were called kouros if it was a male figure, or it was known as a kore if it was a female figure. And during that century, we see what we might describe as the birth of naturalism. That is, Greek sculptors started using their eyes more and more to create these figures, and using canons of proportion or stylistic precedents less and less. And this led to more and more visually convincing statues that were more anatomically accurate and proportionate than the output of any other culture on Earth at the time. Now let's look at another aspect of Archaic Greece besides its artistic output. Now, Greece is just as famous for being the birthplace of democracy as it is for being the birthplace of Western art. And as we'll see, the histories of democracy and sculpture in Greece are intertwined. Now, we don't have to go too much in depth into the origins of Athenian democracy here, but it's enough to know that at the beginning of the Archaic period, around 600 BC, Athens, like many Greek city-states, was ruled by several elite families. So it was basically an oligarchy. So even though power was passed down within these families, these elite families themselves voted to elect one of their own to become archon, and the archon would rule Athens. Now the archon ruled for a limited time before another archon was selected to replace him. So even before real democracy even began, the idea of rule by consent was already sort of in play in Athens, to some extent, while elsewhere, of course, kings and dictators for life were more standard, and this sort of absolute power would be passed from father to son, or else appointed by the previous ruler. Now, the problem with the Athenian system was that these ruling families governed more or less for their own benefit, reducing all other Athenians to serfdom, if not slavery. And this, of course, would lead to periodic revolts. Eventually, one archon was selected who decided to institute far-reaching political reforms, and his name was Solon. And Solon's solution was to basically cancel all debts, free all Athenian slaves, and by that I mean he freed all Athenian slaves, all slaves who were Athenian citizens. There were still plenty of foreign slaves in Athens. And Solon also gave political representation to a larger cross-section of the populace than had enjoyed it before. So any Athenian citizen could now take a case to court, or participate more in the economy, and even hold various public offices according to his social standing. Most importantly, Solon created the Ecclesia, or assembly, which was open to all Athenian citizens. Now, this assembly had both legislative and judicial powers. It elected officials, and when needed, it served as a jury. Now, inside the Ecclesia was the Council of 400, who were elected from the assembly and who served as sort of a steering committee for the deliberations of the larger assembly. And they could also act as a check on the power of the archon. Now, one thing I should point out here is the definition back then of Athenian citizen. So to be recognized as an Athenian citizen, you had to be an adult male, not a slave, not a foreigner, and not poor. So those who qualified as citizens made up approximately 30% of the population at most. And once Athenian slaves were freed with Solon's reforms, that new freedom was balanced out with a sharp increase in the importation of slaves to Athens. So while, yes, power was now out of the hands of just a few families, the ruling class was still a minority of the population. Now, Solon's reforms were instituted around 594, pretty early on in the Archaic period, and his reforms lasted for only a few decades before power in Athens was usurped by a populist tyrant. Now, today we use the word tyrant to mean something like a dictator, but the word had different connotations back then. It simply meant a ruler that came to power through unconventional or unconstitutional means. And just such a man was Pisistratus, a successful military leader for the Athenians who gained tremendous popular support from the disenfranchised lower classes. Pisistratus rose to power in the 560s BC, and his rule was very moderate and successful. He in fact kept the proto-democratic government functioning more or less as it was, with the exception that, of course, he himself could do whatever he wanted and didn't have to give up power. Now, the key to the success of Pisistratus was that what he wanted was basically what Athens generally wanted. So rebellions against his autocratic rule were just not as strong as popular support for it. He fostered the prospering economy, which was heavily reliant on the exportation of olive oil. He instituted a public building program, building the first public fountains and aqueducts in Athens, which provided jobs while enriching and beautifying the city. And he also instituted the Pan-Athenaic Games, the central religious and cultural festival of the Athenians, sort of like a local Olympic Games. A highlight of the Pan-Athenaic Games was this tremendously important ritual procession of the entire city up to the Acropolis, where 100 bulls would be sacrificed to Athena, who was the patron goddess of the city. In addition to all this economic and religious boosterism, Pisistratus encouraged all of the arts as well, and it was under his rule that Greek tragic drama was born. He even commissioned the first written version of the Homeric epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which had heretofore been passed down orally. Now, for the most part, this is all good stuff, and Pisistratus ruled until his death in about 527 BC. And that's when things get worse. Now, Pisistratus had two sons, Hipparchus and Hippias. They appeared to have ruled jointly after their father died, and for a while enjoyed the same sort of popular support as tyrants of Athens that their father had. But then, in 514 BC, Hipparchus was brought down by a lover's quarrel. Now, Hipparchus fell in love with a man named Harmodius. However, Harmodius already had a boyfriend, a man named Aristogiton. Hipparchus was humiliated by his advances being spurned by Harmodius, and when Harmodius told Aristogiton about those advances, Hipparchus was embarrassed even further. So the tyrant Hipparchus took his revenge in this way. He invited the sister of Harmodius to take a lead role in the Pan-Athenaic procession that year, a prestigious honor for an Athenian maiden. However, Just as the ceremony was about to begin, Hipparchus publicly denounced Harmodius's sister and kicked her off the procession on the grounds that the honor of leading the procession should be given only to virgins, which of course implied she wasn't. Apparently, Greece was ruled by middle schoolers at the time. Anyway, Harmodius and his lover Aristogiton took their revenge by murdering Hipparchus. The two lovers were put to death for this, and have since come to be known by history as the Tyrannocides, the slayers of tyrants. And in fact, this event was the beginning of the end of tyranny in Athens. Now Hippias, Hipparchus's surviving brother, became the sole tyrant after his brother's death, and the reign of Hippias was a reign of terror, bitter and cruel, motivated apparently by paranoia and fear of assassination. People were tortured, imprisoned, and killed, and the economy suffered as well. The aristocracy, at this point, began plotting to remove Hippias, and Hippias, meanwhile, actually sought to form an alliance with the king of Persia across the sea in Asia Minor. Hippias apparently wanted to strike a deal whereby he would rule all of Greece as king under the patronage of the great Darius, king of kings and emperor of Persia. The Persian Empire had in fact been eyeing Greece as its next likely conquest, and they'd been snapping up Greek islands and trading outposts one by one over the last several years. So, yeah, this is bad. Essentially, the tyrant of Athens was inviting the most powerful empire in the world to annex his city-state and all the other city-states in Greece. The elite families of Athens had a plan, though. They informed Sparta, their neighboring rival city-state, of the treachery of Hippias and the intentions of King Darius of Persia. At the elite family's request, Sparta stormed Athens and captured Hippias in the year 510. Hippias was not killed, however. He was forced into exile. Hippias and his family then fled to Persia and to the court of King Darius. Now, this little episode in which Hippias betrays his own country is what gave rise to the idea of a tyrant being a bad thing. It was enough to convince the Athenians, it seems, but after Sparta's army had deposed Hippias, the Spartans installed a pro-Spartan Athenian as ruler of Athens. This lasted just a short time, as Athenians were not really in the mood to capitulate to anyone, not Persia and not Sparta. In 508 BC, 2 years after the exile of the tyrant Hippias, the Athenian nobleman Cleisthenes was installed as ruler, and it's Cleisthenes we remember today as the true father of Athenian democracy. In a nutshell, Cleisthenes' reforms weakened the aristocracy by promoting the rights of average citizens to be equal to the aristocrats. So although you may be richer than other Athenians, that wealth cannot grant you automatic power. He expanded the Council of 400 to 500 to accommodate more representatives of the people, and instituted procedural reforms that allowed for true democracy. Any Athenian citizen now had the right to vote on each and every law under consideration of the government, and to speak his mind in assembly. On top of this, Cleisthenes took steps to ensure that a populist tyrant could not again rise to power in Athens. Every year, citizens had the opportunity to vote to have a single citizen sent into exile for 10 years. Votes were written down on shards of broken pottery, and the word in Greek for these little shards was ostrika. Now these ostrika were tallied, and whoever received the most votes was then ostracized. So anyone who was becoming a little too popular or too influential with whatever faction in Athenian society could be removed temporarily to reduce the possibility of tyranny. Ostracism wasn't necessarily a shameful thing in Athenian society. After all, it often happened to the most popular people. Full rights as a citizen were retained after ostracism, and the property of an ostracized person was maintained during their exile, and there was no stigma attached to that person upon their return. And legend has it that the first person ostracized by Cleisthenes' invention was Cleisthenes himself. So one more step Cleisthenes took to promote his new style of government and to prevent tyranny involved sculpture directly. Cleisthenes commissioned a memorial statue of the two Tyrannocides, Harmodius and Aristogiton. He placed these sculptures in the meeting place for the assembly, which was also basically the town square, known as the Agora. The sculptures were intended to serve as a constant reminder of the recent past of Athens, but also to instill a sense of civic duty and sacrifice in the Athenian citizenry. The story of the Tyrannocides was remembered for much more than being a love triangle gone wrong. They were seen as martyrs of Athenian democracy and freedom. Now, these two statues, which are now lost, were remarkable in a few ways. First of all, they were statues of actual people, not gods like Apollo, not legendary figures like Cleobis and Beton, but Athenian citizens who lived just a few years before the statues were made. Nor were the subjects of these statues rulers or kings or champion athletes, and these sculptures didn't celebrate any sort of victory in the traditional sense. And it wasn't a funerary monument either, standing in a temple or on a grave. It was in the public. The statues of the Tyrannocides can be seen as essentially the first civic monuments made in Western civilization, made to embody a civic ideal and honor those who strove towards that ideal. Monuments as far-flung as the Minuteman statue by Daniel Chester French, or Rodin's Burghers of Calais, or the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C., all these statues can trace their lineage back to the Tyrannocides. Now, if we expand the genre of civic monuments slightly to include allegorical work, we can think of the Statue of Liberty, or Jules Deleuze's Monument to the Republic, or even Michelangelo's David, all as sculpture designed to promote civic ideals, and therefore can also be thought of as descendants, thematically at least, of the Tyrannocides. One more way in which these two sculptures were notable is that they were done in cast bronze. Now, when did the Greeks learn how to make life-size bronze statues? And while we're on the subject, how did the Greeks make statues out of stone or marble? Well, we're going to hear all about it when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey everybody, just dropping a quick reminder that when I'm not doing travel workshops, I'm at home in Florence playing around in my studio, as I should be. Along with various personal projects that I have ongoing, I also find the time to teach, but I don't do regular classes. What I prefer is to teach private or semi-private courses designed to fit the needs of an individual or a small group. So, for example, if you want to come to Florence and learn sculpture, but you only have, say, 2 weeks off of work, or even a week, and maybe you want to learn something very specific, like how to make a piece mold, or you want to focus on artistic anatomy, I can make that happen. You just tell me what your interests are and what your time constraints are, and we'll work something out. And if you bring a friend or two and make it a small group course, the price drops. So also, when I'm not teaching or working on my own stuff, I'm also organizing tours of Florence's sites and museums, as well as tours of my own studio. So if your stay in Florence is just a matter of days or even hours, and you want to experience Florence with someone who knows his way around, well, I'm your man. I can put together an itinerary based on your specific interests, as well as maybe show you a few things you might have missed had you stuck to the guidebooks. It's actually one of my favorite things to do, and I get to experience Florence through the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time, which helps to keep it fresh for me. Now, if you're looking for more information, all you have to do is drop me a message anywhere I might find it. You can email me at thesculptorsfuneral@gmail.com, or you can go to jason@jasonarkles.com, or you can even get to me through Facebook or Instagram, WhatsApp, whatever. So, come on over. Check out Florence. And now, back to the Greeks. So let's take a break from political history for a moment and look at what the Greeks call techne, the skills and processes involved in making sculpture in the Archaic period of ancient Greece. So from the last episode, we know that the Archaic period charts a steady progression towards more naturalistic, more lifelike sculpture. What were the artistic processes the Greek sculptors started to use in order to make more naturalistic sculpture? Well, we don't know. If there was anything like a how-to manual for sculptors written at the time, it hasn't been preserved down to our own day. The sculptor Polykleitos in the 5th century, which is after the Archaic period in the 6th century, Polykleitos did write a treatise on the method and source of his canon of proportion and his aesthetic process, and it may well have included some sort of instructional component, but unfortunately for us, that book is lost to history. Now, we can assume that the study of anatomy became important and widespread among sculptors, as well as some sort of process of visual analysis, in other words, some sort of systematic use of living models. But the only evidence we have for anything is in the surviving sculptures themselves. But we do know, at least in technical terms, how marble and bronze sculptures were created back then, and this is also learned through studying the sculptures themselves, especially studying the sculptures that the archaic Greeks left unfinished. There are actually quite a few unfinished archaic sculptures, and even the location of these abandoned statues can tell us a bit about how they were made. And the place where we find the greatest number of unfinished statues is in the quarries of Greece. So go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and you can click on the link for the image galleries you find there on the homepage, and then you can click on the link for this episode, which is episode number 76. And there you will see a few images of half-carved statues lying on the ground in various locations in quarries, specifically on the island of Naxos, which was an important source for marble for statues in the archaic world. So what do we see here in these unfinished works lying on the ground? Well, the first thing to point out is that they are all over life size, and not just by a little bit. The so-called Kouros of Flerio would stand over 4.5 meters high, or over 15 feet, almost as big as Michelangelo's David. And the Milanese Kouros, in a different quarry on the same island of Naxos, is over 10 meters long, 35 feet tall. And I suppose this all makes sense, that the unfinished sculptures we find at the quarries are enormous, because, of course, the smaller works, finished or unfinished, would have been stolen away over the centuries, eventually maybe ending up in collections or museums, like the life-sized but unfinished Kouros in the Archaeological Museum in Athens, which also came from a quarry on Naxos. So the others, the ones that we see in the quarries, were just too big to take away. And in the case of the Kouros of Flerio, it appears that the legs broke off during transport out of the quarry, and then the sculpture was just immediately abandoned where it broke. But in the case of the Milanese Kouros, the one 35 feet long, it was abandoned before it was ever detached from the bedrock. And from this, we can learn a lot. Now, this Milanese Kouros seems to have been carved in the following manner. First, a sloping hillside of exposed marble was chosen, and this was done so that the future statue, this block of stone that you're going to be working, could be traced out right at ground level. Then, a rectangular trench was carved out all around this sort of chosen area, which formed a block of marble in the center of the trench. The trench would be deep enough and wide enough for quarrymen to get in and work on the sides of the block. And then, before the block was detached from the bedrock, carving began on the statue itself. Now, the reason for this is easy to imagine. The more finished the work is in situ, the lighter it's going to be for transport. And also, having it lying down makes for easier access, especially when you're carving a 35-foot tall statue. And having its back attached to the bedrock as it was gave it stability when you worked. So after the carving was taken as far as it could go, the carvers would then drill holes at the bottom of the trench, sort of under the back of the statue, because the statue would be sort of lying attached to the bedrock but facing up. And you drill these holes under its back in order to sort of honeycomb the marble, connecting the statue to the bedrock. And with enough holes drilled under the back of the statue could then be sort of pried off of the bedrock and then hauled out of the trench and taken away. And by the way, we find unfinished statues in the quarries of Egypt, which demonstrate this exact process. So it wasn't unique to the Greeks and probably not even original to the Greeks. So we're not sure why the Milanese Kouros was abandoned, the big 35-foot tall one. Maybe it was just too big to move. Or maybe one of the several cracks now running through the abandoned statue made its first appearance during the quarrying. But for whatever reason, having the statue lying there, still attached to the bedrock, gives us a lot of insight into how it was made. But it also raises a lot of questions. For instance, since the sculptures were half carved right there in the quarries, does that mean that the sculptors of these kuroi also did the quarrying themselves? Or at least oversee the process? Or rather, did quarrymen just simply cut out blanks for the sculptors? After all, the only thing that really varies from one kouros to another is the scale and in the details. In the last episode, I mentioned how the kouros pose is rigidly uniform. It's a frontal pose with the left leg extended and only minor variations in the positions of the arms. So it seems possible that the quarrymen may simply have just sort of followed a general pattern and then sold these sort of template kuroi forms to whoever wanted to buy and then sculpt them to completion. I mean, if I had to guess, I would surmise that they were indeed blanks that were then taken to the sculptors, rather than sculptors having to journey to distant island quarries every time they had a commission. And this also might help to explain why archaic sculpture followed this unchanging compositional structure and formulaic proportions. In the classical world, sculptors were known by their location. They had names such as Antenor of Athens or Hegelidas of Argos. But their works were not consistently out of local stone. So any prolific sculptor would have found it easier and cheaper to import these half-carved blanks than to travel to the quarry, carve out their block themselves, and then accompany their half-finished block back to where they came from. Well, that's a theory anyway. But there are several archaic sculptures that blow this theory apart, because there are sculptures that do not follow the basic kouros pattern. One of the most famous archaic works is called the Muscopherous, or calf-bearer. It's a rather happy-looking kouros, and he's carrying a bull calf slung over his shoulders. Now this work, as well as many others, like the fragmentary rampant horseman, must have been carved out from much less specifically shaped blocks of marble. Or perhaps the sculptor himself did indeed supervise the initial quarry cutting to suit his original designs. In any event, the Muscopherous is a small enough statue that it could have been carved out of just a basic block of marble that was quarried and then transported. And now let's talk about bronze sculpture. So the Archaic period saw quite a change in process from one end of the 6th century to the other. Bronze casting had been practiced since the dawn of the Bronze Age, as you might guess, but until the Archaic period, hollow casting bronze statues on a large scale was unknown. Of course, casting in bronze at any sort of large scale, any scale larger than a small figurine, has to be done hollow, right? Because bronze shrinks considerably when it cools, and so if the casting is not of an even thickness, as it is when you're casting something hollow, the bronze will deform and crack and all sorts of bad things. So at first, at least in the surviving examples that we find, bronze casting is solid and at a small scale. But that doesn't mean that there were no large bronze figures before the Archaic period. But these large bronze figures were not cast hollow. They were made by hammering sheets of bronze into form, a technique known today as repoussé. And then these sheets of beaten bronze would then be riveted together to make a statue. Now, only a few of these archaic bronzes survive today, and they're smaller than life size. And it's interesting because the idea to make a hollow metal statue out of beaten bronze may have originated with the evolution of plate armor, which was beaten into form in the same way. And there are examples of this beaten and riveted armor going all the way back to the 7th century BC, and this armor was beaten into anatomical forms, like breastplates with abdominal muscles and pecs. So the idea behind this theory is if you can make a breastplate to look like a human chest, why stop there? Why not make a whole figure? So we don't know precisely who made the first hollow cast bronzes in Greece or exactly when. But the earliest surviving hollow-cast bronzes of a large scale seem to date from 530 BC or so, kind of in the late Archaic period. I should point out that most of the sculpture that survives from ancient Greece comes in the form of marble and stone statues rather than bronze, because bronze is a valuable metal which can be melted down and reused, and after a few thousand years of war and cultural upheaval in the Mediterranean basin, most of the statues made in bronze from this time were melted down. Many that do survive do so because they were once lost and only relatively recently rediscovered. For instance, the earliest life-size hollow-cast bronze that we have, known as the Perez Apollo, was actually only discovered in 1959, accidentally dug up with a dozen other statues, both in bronze and marble. And these sculptures were discovered at the port of Athens, which is known as Piraeus. Now, this treasure trove may well have been looted from a temple somewhere in Greece during the occupation of the ancient Romans in the 1st century BC, and then hidden away in the port city of Piraeus, but never taken to their intended destination for who knows what reason. In any event, that's where the Perez Apollo comes from, and we see that this statue is in the familiar form of a kouros, and the anatomical detail and proportion date it to the later decades of the Archaic period, 530 or 520, or, thereabouts. But let's take a closer look at the Perez Apollo, this very early life-sized hollow Greek bronze. You can do that, of course, at the image gallery for this episode, or you can just Google Perez Apollo, and you'll get all sorts of photos of it. A few things we notice right off. We can clearly see why this work is dated to the later Archaic period. The proportions are just more natural than earlier kouroi, and the anatomy is generally correct, if still a little stylized and schematic. We see that forms are sort of flowing smoothly from one to another over the surface of the statue, just like they appear visually on the human body in life. So the sculptor, whoever he was using his eyes to some extent, in addition to a canon of proportion. But there are a few things that make this kouros different from all others we've seen. One is that the sculptor got a little crazy and made his kouros with the right leg extended instead of his left. What a rebel. Now, as I've mentioned, kouroi almost always had their left leg extended, possibly due to the formulaic manner in which the kouros would initially be quarried. But of course, this kouros, the Perez Apollo, was not quarried. It was modeled in clay or wax and then cast in bronze. So you didn't have to follow any sort of pattern. But our sculptor didn't stop there. Not only are the positions of the legs reversed, but both arms of the figure are partially raised and not attached to the thighs, which is another near-universal component of the archaic kouros. In fact, the position of the arms has led some art historians to wonder if this Apollo was maybe driving a chariot at one point. Whatever the reason for the position of the arms, this was only made possible, again, by the fact that the work was modeled and not carved out of a predetermined blank from a distant quarry. It would appear that with the arrival of cast bronze kouroi, appearing sometime around 530 or 520 as far as we know, the possibilities of variety in pose were just beginning to dawn on the Greek sculptors. And that brings us back to the Tyrannocides, the life-size bronze statues of Harmodius and Aristogiton, commissioned by the father of democracy, Cleisthenes. These statues were made in the last years of the 6th century, around 510 or 509 BC, only a few decades after the Perez Apollo. The name of the sculptors of the Tyrannocides was Antenor of Athens, and almost nothing is known about him, though what little we think we know is intriguing. The only other works attributed to Antenor of Athens, besides the bronze Tyrannocides, are two works in marble typical of late archaic work. So Antenor apparently worked in bronze and marble both. Now, if you remember our discussion of the rise of figurative sculpture in the Florentine Renaissance, you might recall that one of the major technical advances from the Gothic era to the early Renaissance was the cross-pollination of techniques between goldsmiths and stone carvers, two separate crafts that, once united, changed the way sculpture looks. With Antenor of Athens, it appears a similar cross-pollination occurred, and this unification of technique seems to have played out in ancient Greece just as it did in the Renaissance. In the early Renaissance, we see that Gothic sculpture was fairly rigid and formulaic, not to the extent that it was in archaic Greece, but pretty formulaic nonetheless. And then Lorenzo Gaberty creates the first life-size bronze figure made in Italy in 1,000 years, and naturally he does this by first making a model in clay or wax. Marble carvers like Donatello started to model their works in a preliminary form, a rough draft, if you will, in clay or wax, and then copy their modeling into marble. And this process allowed for poses of more variety and technical daring to be attempted, which gave birth to the Renaissance style of sculpture. In archaic Greece, it seems to have played out in exactly the same way. The advent of large bronzes and the processes used to create them freed sculptors from the rigid archaic pose. New possibilities were first explored in bronze sculpture, which then influenced the production of marble sculpture. So what about Antenor of Athens' masterpieces, the Tyrannocides? What did they look like? Were they more or less just a slight adaptation of the Kouros pose, like the Perez Apollo, or were they something radically different? We can't know for sure because they no longer exist. They stood in the Agora of Athens only for about 25 years before they were stolen during a pretty thrilling and momentous chapter in Athenian history, which we'll get to in the next episode. However, a second version of the Tyrannocides was commissioned to replace Antenor's originals, and these were made by two Athenian sculptors named Critios and Naissance, who were most likely pupils of Antenor of Athens himself. And these copies were done about 15 years after the originals were stolen. So did Critios and Naissance have a cast from the original bronze by Antenor of Athens to make those replacements? Or were the new statues simply made from memory of the originals? Or were they an entirely new composition and not a copy of the first statues at all? Well, we don't know for sure. In fact, not even the replacements made by Critios and Naissance survive. We only know those through marble copies made much later during the Roman occupation of Greece, hundreds of years later. And these marble copies contain a lot of anachronistic additions and restorations, not the least of which are tree trunks acting as third legs to support the marble figures, a device that, of course, would have been unnecessary on the bronze originals. So all we have as evidence of Antenor's Tyrannocides are 1st century AD copies of a 4th century BC replacement of the 5th century original. However, given all this uncertainty, we can at least speculate that the marble Tyrannocides we know today are quite different from Antenor's original work because the poses of the marble Tyrannocide statues would have been an utter game changer in the history of sculpture in 510 BC. Each of these two marble statues is standing in a pose entirely unknown in the world of the archaic Kouros. The stiff frontal pose of the Kouros is entirely gone, replaced with a lunging thrust of the arm of Aristogiton, which once held a sword, while the statue of Harmodius raises his own sword high above his head, ready to deliver a killing blow. The legs of both of these statues, at least in the Roman copies, are spread apart with knees bent, indicating an active forward motion, while the torsos are sort of turned to the side as though they're, sort of in a fencing position. The heads are, well, if not outright portraits, at least they're character studies. The older Aristogiton with a beard, and the younger Harmodius clean-shaven. So the poses of these marble statues are just light years ahead of any other sculpture datable to 510 BC. Of course, that doesn't mean it couldn't have happened. I've already mentioned the several ways in which the Tyrannocides were fundamentally different sculptures than the typical Kouros which came before them. These statues serve an entirely new purpose, different from the Kouroi. Maybe the unprecedented forms of these works are merely following their unprecedented function. And just on a technical level, the poses of the Tyrannocides might just be the logical next step after the opening up of gesture that we see starting to emerge in the Perez Apollo. Made possible, of course, by the sculptor working in bronze rather than marble. However, there exists further arguments against attributing the complete novelty of the Tyrannocides to the original sculptor, Antenor of Athens. First, I mentioned that we have another statue which survives by the hand of Antenor, and it's even signed. And it's a monumental kore, a female statue, beautifully done, but in the characteristic pose and style of archaic sculptors. That is, it's, in the regular, completely frontal pose. And in the traditionally stylized details of this kore, there's just no hint in this work that the same sculptor could or would have produced the dramatic poses of the Tyrannocides. And then there's another question, centering on the portrait of the statue of Harmodius, the clean-shaven one of the two. Now remember, I'm referring to the Roman copies of the replacements, and these were made by Critios and Naissance. But even so, in this Roman copy, the portrait of Harmodius seems to be a very close relative, stylistically speaking, to a late Archaic marble kouros found in Athens dating to 480 BC. And this kouros is decidedly not by Antenor of Athens. This kouros has a style and a look very foreign to the style and look of the Kore by Antenor, but because the portrait of this particular kouros and the portrait of Harmodius seem to be done by the same hand, this kouros has come to be known as the Cretan boy, named after Critios, who we know to have sculpted the Harmodius figure and who we presume to have also made this kouros. In any event, regardless of who sculpted what in the years between 510 and 480 BC, what is undisputed is that momentous changes in the nature of sculpture were happening. The shift from sculptors working directly into stone using canons of proportion to modeling more naturalistic work in clay and wax and then casting into bronze opened up unexplored possibilities which eventually led to classic Greek sculpture. And no other work exemplifies this change more than the kouros known as Critios boy. In addition to its naturalism in modeling, the Critios boy exhibits, for the first time in history, one of the central attributes of the Greek style, and possibly the most fundamental and far-reaching stylistic attribute in the history of figurative sculpture, as important today as it was 2,000 years ago. The Critios boy is the first example we have of a statue standing in Contrapposto. Well, I want to thank you all once again for listening. Now, the next episode, we're going to cover one of the most amazing periods of Greek history in both art and politics, starting right where we left off with Critios boy, and also covering some of the most famous battles in world history. Now, don't forget, you can check out additional content at the Sculptor's Funeral website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, or on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook group page. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast or Stitcher or Podcast Addict or any of the dozens of podcast apps out there. And you can receive the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device as soon as new episodes appear. And if you want to help the podcast reach other people like you, go ahead and leave a review or give the podcast a rating wherever you subscribe. Also, as always, at the sculptorsfuneral.com website, you can stream the complete archives of the show, you can check out the image galleries for this and other episodes, and you can support the podcast by buying some Sculptor's Funeral merchandise or by making a donation. And finally, click on the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies, at thesculptorsfuneral.com. Clicking on the link and buying from Blick helps to support the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.